Okay, so quick reminder that Thursday is the last time for several weeks that we're going to be working with this book, right? So after Thursday, you won't need to bring this to class anymore. We're going to be working with this book, with Voltaire's Candide. I will give you some guide questions at the end of next class to help you through the reading, to give you a couple of things to focus on. And I will also, not Thursday, but next Tuesday, so a week from today, I'll give you the assignment sheet for paper 1 so that you will know so that you'll have some sense of what we're going to be doing with the Voltaire book and with the Rousseau book, right? What's going to be expected of you. And you'll have plenty of time to think that through and ask for help. So does anybody have any questions about anything that's coming up before we get started? Okay, great. So let's just do a quick, where the hell is the eraser? I am, as you can probably tell, really not used to this space. It doesn't actually seem conducive to teaching because I've only got this tiny little board to work with, and I need room to sprawl. I need to scribble. This is not good for me. Okay, so I just want to quickly review from where we got to last class. All right, when we talk about evidence, what do we mean? What is evidence? What do we mean by evidence in this course?
Data that can be verified.
Exactly, yes. Data that can be looked up, that can be verified. So, on the whole, statements that are objectively true, right? So then what is a claim and what is its relationship to evidence?
It interprets evidence.
Yes, good. A claim is an interpretation of evidence. Good. So a claim is something that is not objectively true. It is generated from evidence. And it is your assertion about what a particular piece of evidence means, right? Or a particular pattern in evidence, as we're going to talk a little bit more about today. All right, now this third one, warrant. What's the warrant if we're talking about parts of an argument?
It's a justification.
Yeah, a warrant is that justification that links your claim to your evidence, right? It's that connecting logic, right? This is why I can make this leap. This is what allows me to make this interpretation based on this evidence. And this is probably something that you are not used to having to do in papers, but I am generally going to expect in your papers that you explain to me not just what you're getting from your evidence, right, how you're interpreting it, but why you're interpreting it that way, right? What justifies your interpretation?
Like a thought process.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of it, like doing a math problem, right? Like, you have to. It doesn't matter if you get the answer right or if you didn't show your work, right? Generally, what the instructor wants to see is your process. Yeah, Michaela.
So what makes it so different from a claim? Like what distinguishes it so much from a claim? Because they just sound very similar.
Okay, so it might help illustrate that for you if we give you an example.
Yeah, I just need an example.
Right. Okay, so let's go to one of our examples from last time, right? Just the simplest one. So I make the claim. I'm not really sure that illustrates the point particularly well. All right, how do I want to do this? Your question has got me slightly flummoxed for the moment. I am trying to think how best to answer, how to answer it in a way that will help you the most. Okay, so you know what? Somebody give me a piece of data. Somebody give me a piece of evidence, say. A fact that's objectively true.
There are roughly 350 million Americans.
Okay. There are roughly 350 million Americans. Can anyone make a claim based on this piece of data?
Some of them are women.
Well, that would probably be, if none of them are women, that would be really weird, right? So that wouldn't so much be a claim, right? That's like, you can actually look up, right, how many of them are women. It's slightly more than 50% of them are women, right? So, maybe we can do something with that, right? So, let's say women make up slightly more than half of the US population. Okay. So that'll be our piece of evidence here, right? Now, can somebody make a claim based on this evidence?
The population is better off because there are more women or something.
Okay. I think, we'd need more than that to make that claim, right? More than this. So can anybody so if women make up slightly more than half of the US population, why don't we try to maybe put this in a frame say politics or reaching voters or things like that, right? Can we make a political claim based on it, or a claim about how politics works based on this, or what political parties might need to do? In order to win elections. If slightly more than half of the US population is women.
They should gear their political statements slightly more towards women.
Okay, good. Yes, that's a claim. Good. Yes, that's an interpretation of this piece of evidence. Okay, so political messaging should be made to appeal to women. All right, good. We're getting somewhere. Here's our evidence, here's our claim. Now, our warrant would be the logical connection between these two statements, right? So what's the logical leap we're making here, right? What is the logical connection between women making up slightly more than half the population and political messaging being made to appeal to women? How can we make this claim based on this piece of evidence?
By getting more women to vote, that's...
Yeah, if most of the population is women, most voters are women, right? So that would be your warrant. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Okay. Anybody else confused about this at all, or having any trouble with this? Okay. So it's good that we did this little review, right? All right, so does anybody have any questions before I get started talking about thesis statements and thesis development? Does anybody have any questions about about the chapter, about the reading for this time? Was there anything that confused you or that you'd like to focus in on a little bit?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Brittany.
So, you know, what we just learned, the claim, evidence, and the warrant, you want us to have that in our writing from now on?
Yeah, so essentially, like, what you're going to be looking for in your average paragraph, right? You're not really going to want more than one main claim per paragraph, right? And, you know, I don't like reducing writing down to formulas, but, you know, these are just kind of rules of thumb that let you know whether you're on the right track or not, right? So there should be one main claim per paragraph. Tested against one or two important pieces of evidence with a warrant that provides that logical connection, right? Remember, again, that I am not, I am not Svengali, the mystical mind reader. I do not always know why you make the logical leaps you do. So you will have to explain to me what your reasoning is when you're making a particular interpretation, right? So yeah, in general, this is what you're going to want to include per paragraph, right? And a good paragraph is usually about half a page long, right? If it's much longer than that, then you're probably biting off a little bit more than you can chew in that paragraph, and you're going to need to find a place to break it up, right? You're probably talking about more than one main idea, and you're going to need to find a place to split it.
It's about how many sentences?
Yeah, I mean, some people write longer sentences than others. It's hard to break it down to that kind of a fine-grained analysis. But yeah, I would say, again, as long as you're kind of following this basic rule of thumb, you're probably in good shape.
Oh.
The big thing that you want to, the thing with paragraphing, right, the reason we do it is to signpost to your reader that you're moving on to a different idea, right? And if you just kind of give me a giant block of undifferentiated text, then I have to figure out for myself where you're making those shifts. And, I can do that, but I'd rather not. So I want to see that you can identify where you're making those shifts, right? Okay, other questions? Okay, so then let's get into our main topic for the day. What's a thesis?
Claim.
Okay, it is a claim, right? It is a claim. And is your thesis going to be a claim about one or two pieces of evidence? Yeah, your thesis is going to have to be a much bigger claim, right? It's going to have to be a little broader, and it's going to have to account for a much wider field of evidence, right? So let me give you a couple of characteristics, right, that a good thesis statement needs to have. So first, it needs to be arguable. And it needs to be arguable in three senses, right? Arguable here means three things. The first is that it is something that is not immediately obvious to everyone who examines this thing, right? Why would you not want to have a thesis statement that is immediately obvious to anyone who's looking at the same thing you are?
Because everybody's already going to know what you're talking about and not be interested.
Yeah, what would be the point, right? You know, there's no point making an argument that cookies are delicious, right? Cookies are fucking awesome. Right? Everybody loves cookies.
You could make a claim about whose cookies are particularly tasty.
You could, right? Yeah, or which particular varieties of cookie are best, right? You know, but that would be again an interpretation of, cookie data, right? You know. So that would be arguable. Making the claim that cookies are delicious would not be, right? That also has to be supported, something you can support with evidence. So it has to be something that other people looking at the same evidence would regard as a reasonable interpretation of that evidence, right? So, you cannot, for example, you could argue, but it would be a bad argument. You could not argue that, Voltaire's Candide was broadcast into the author's mind by space aliens, right? No one else who reads the novella would actually come to that conclusion based on what's in it, right? There's no evidence of space alien interference. So it has to be a plausible interpretation that is supported by evidence. And it also has to be something that is open to alternative interpretations. Not only should a reasonable person be able to look at your argument and see how you came to that conclusion, right, regarded as plausible, they should also be able to come up with a different interpretation looking at the same evidence, right? Because, again, like if you're looking at if your argument is something that is not something someone else could disagree with, again, right, what's the point in making the argument, right? So everybody with me here on what I mean by arguable. Is anybody confused about any of this? Everybody good? Okay, great. So your thesis is also going to need to be relatively narrow. And by narrow, it means like it takes a large field of data and reduces the scope to a specific pattern of details, right? That you're going to try to explain. And finally, your thesis needs to be productive. Now, what we mean by this is that it helps provide the paper with a logical structure. So it probably, so it might actually help as a kind of analogy to think of the thesis as being almost like the paper's spine, right? What does the spine do in the human body?
Gives it shape.
Yeah, it gives it shape, right? And it's the thing that everything else is connected to, right? It's the thing that supports everything else.
It also allows it to stand on its own.
Yeah. So think of the thesis as being like a spine, right? And each paragraph as being, like a rib or a bone coming off of the spine. So in each paragraph, you will be testing your thesis against specific pieces of evidence and shaping and refining it over the course of the paper. But you need to have that shape at the center from the beginning, right? Okay. So we're going to do a little bit of work together to figure out how all of this works, right? But does anybody have any questions they want to ask so far? I just want to make sure nobody's getting left behind or confused here. Okay. Great. So, do you remember this formula from a couple of sessions ago? Seems to be about X. Is really about Y. Okay, this looks familiar. Okay, good. So this is actually kind of not a bad shape for a working thesis statement, right? So what a good thesis statement is often going to do is put two ideas into dialogue or tension with each other, right? So there's going to be one idea that you're reacting against and one idea that you're arguing for, right? So encoded in your thesis, you're going to have two alternate interpretations, but only one is the thing that you're actually arguing for, right? So to give you an example, right, let's think back to the poem about the baseball game that we looked at a couple of sessions ago, right? So what were some of the ideas people came up with about that? Does anybody still have any of that in your notes, or? Let's look at some of your seems to be about X, but it is really about Y stuff.
More like a discussion.
What, you know, like what we did in class, or?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think like it was a discussion that was kind of aiming to get one of these seems to be about X, but is really about Y statements about the poem. So why don't you all just kind of like look at what you got for a second, think on it, and I'll give you an example as you're considering, right? So, have any of you seen the movie Alien? Okay, at least one of you. Only one of you. Okay, I keep thinking like either I need to update my pop culture references or y'all need to watch better movies.
It's the latter of the two.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Okay, so Ethan, you've seen Alien. Tell me a little bit about Alien. What kind of movie is Alien?
About as action movie as you can imagine.
Okay,
With a touch of horror.
okay. So a touch of horror, okay. We'll get to that in a minute. What other broad genre does it seem to belong to?
Thriller, maybe?
Okay, horror, thriller, yeah, science fiction, okay. And yeah, it's usually classified as a science fiction movie, right? So that's kind of like if you, back when there were video stores, when dinosaurs roamed the earth and we had to make fire by rubbing sticks together. and movies came on these big blocky plastic tapes.
Wait, does it have Will Ferrell in it?
No, this is Alien is. I think Alien came out in 1977. So yeah,
Reese Witherspoon?
No. Definitely not. No, Sigourney Weaver is
Sigourney
the
Weaver. Right,
lead
right.
actress. Yeah, and most of you probably don't even know who that is. So yeah, so when we think about a science fiction film, right, or a science fiction story, what kinds of elements does it usually have? What do we usually expect from science fiction?
Lots of science.
Okay, science. In particular, what kinds of science are often the focus?
Supernatural powers.
Pardon?
Supernatural powers.
Well, if it's science fiction, the supernatural powers usually have some kind of scientific explanation, right? So, like the Incredible Hulk gets those powers because he's been bombarded with gamma rays, with all this radiation. So, it's not good science that provides the explanation, but there's supposedly a scientific explanation for why he does that, right? Now, horror usually does feature supernatural creatures, right? Right, monsters and shit. Vampires, werewolves, things of that nature. But yeah, so science, okay, like if we're looking at a science fiction story, like when is it usually set? When do we tend to expect a science fiction story to be set?
In the future.
Yeah, often in the future, right? And what does that future usually look like?
Very advanced.
Yeah, we're often talking about like advanced technology, right? So give me some examples of what that advanced tech might look like.
Star Wars.
Flying cars.
Okay, flying cars, yeah, the shit they promised us in the 50s and never got us, right? Gave us, right? Instead, they gave us smartphones. Thanks. But yeah, things like flying cars, spaceships, robots, advanced computers, right? Maybe even, advances in biology and chemistry like cloning, stuff like that. And a lot of science fiction, but not all science fiction, views technology as a means of solving a problem, right? Classic science fiction in particular usually views technology as something that the engineer hero does or uses to fix some major social problem or some kind of big ecological problem, right? So usually the attitude is right, tech good. Now, what about a horror movie? So I said the horror movies often feature monsters, right? How many of you watch horror movies? Okay, yeah, good. Awesome. Great. Me too. Love them. Okay. So what features does a horror movie usually have, apart from, some of like those kind of supernatural things, monsters and, vampires, werewolves, and whatnot?
Suspense.
Okay, yeah. There's a lot of effort expended in building suspense. What else usually happens in a horror movie? Or what other features does a horror movie usually
A lot of
have?
jump scares.
Okay, many will feature jump scares, right? And often kind of like red herring jump scares too, right? It's like, something jumps out at you and it's really just, the heroine's little brother in a mask or something, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, jump scares are not uncommon. Even if we look at the way horror movies are shot, right? The kind of the lighting and the settings, right? Like what do they usually look like?
The atmosphere is much darker.
Okay, yeah, they tend to be science fiction movies are often really brightly lit, right? Horror movies usually are, kind of dark and gloomy. Right, you often can't see clearly what's happening on the screen. Even actually some of the most, I'm thinking back to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you rarely actually see any act of violence committed on screen. You hear it, and then you see the results, but you don't actually see Leatherface or his family going around chopping people up with chainsaws. Probably because that would have been too difficult for their special effects crew, but it's neither horror movies are often also very cheaply made. What else? What about the characters in a horror movie?
They're kind of dumb.
Okay, explain.
They just do stuff nobody would, like, you don't go down to a basement.
Okay. And how old are the characters in a typical horror movie?
Like
Usually they're young.
teenagers?
Yeah, teens or young adults, right? And there's usually a group of them, right, who are friends.
It, for example.
What's that?
Pennywise in
Yeah.
It and that movie.
And how many of these teens or young adults will typically survive?
One.
Usually just one, right? And how is the survivor usually different from the others?
He's this-
Luckier.
He's alive.
What's that?
He's alive.
Okay. Right, touche. I guess I asked for that. Okay, in terms of behavior throughout the film, right? How is the survivor usually different from the other characters?
It's usually one of two ways. It's either they're lucky
Uh-huh.
or they're just smarter than the rest of them.
Okay, let's think about the way a horror movie usually defines smarter too, because it's actually weirdly specific, right? What happens in horror movies to characters who drink?
Quick.
They die, yep. A character who does drugs dies. A character who has sex dies. So the survivor is usually the goody two-shoes, right? The rule follower. So horror movies actually have a really conservative morality, right? Even though, they're often shockingly violent, right? They tend to reinforce a very traditional, very traditional kind of moral code. Now, let's apply this to the movie Alien, which only one of you has seen, and this is a travesty and miscarriage of justice and must be rectified at some point. So, okay, set in the future, check, right? Far future, space travel, check. Like it's about a group of characters who are basically truckers in space, right? They are fly a cargo ship for this company that is always kind of off-screen, but also kind of subtly controls their actions. Robots, check. Although we don't learn there are robots on the ship until about halfway through the movie. Right? One of the crew members turns out to be a robot who's been programmed to sacrifice the lives of the others to capture one of these aliens for the company. The computer also turns out to be working against them, programmed by the company to accomplish this particular mission. And only one character survives. The character who survives is one Ellen Ripley, who is the ship's warrant officer. Now, I'm not sure how familiar any of you are with various naval duties or ranks, but does anybody know what a warrant officer does, what they're responsible for? A warrant officer is responsible for enforcing the rules. So we see in Alien a lot of horror movie elements, right? On the one hand, the nature of the survivor is very much a horror movie kind of thing. She's not just the rule follower, she's the one who's responsible for making everyone else follow the rules, and they all die when they don't. the ship is dark, gloomy, and you don't see the creature very often. It just kind of jumps out quickly, and you hear screams. And yeah, by the way, don't watch this movie on an airplane. I made that mistake. And yeah, most of the plot is people moving slowly down the various like air tunnels on the ship, trying to find this creature and not get killed by it, right? So you're constantly waiting for the thing to jump out of the shadows and grab somebody. There's also a really, really creepy moment where the guy who turns out to be a robot, they find him, they find out, they destroy him, and they reanimate his head to ask him questions. It's really cool, but really creepy. So what we have is a movie with kind of superficial science fiction trappings that doesn't really follow the usual science fiction ethos, right? About how technology is something that in fact helps us solve problems, right? In fact, the tech is often what causes the problems in the movie or exacerbates the problems. It makes things harder for the crew. So we could come up with a thesis from this, something like, and it seems like I just don't have a good marker option here. Either it doesn't write or it sticks to the board. That's great. Everything's great. So while Alien is set in a distant future with advanced technology, thus seems to be science fiction, the movie's horror elements suggest an anxiety about the increasing intelligence of technological devices. So the basic argument that I'm making here is that the horror elements are more important than the superficial sci-fi trappings and tell us more about what the movie means, right? So what we've got here is a two-part thesis where we've got one idea reacting against another, right? The idea we're actually trying to argue versus a kind of an alternative interpretation that is often a little bit more superficial, right? So how can we tell in a sentence structure like this which part is what I'm actually trying to argue and which is the idea I'm reacting against?
Trying to argue for it being a horror and against it being a science fiction.
Yes, and how can we tell just from the structure of the sentence?
By the first word, while. You're automatically setting yourself up for contrast.
Okay. Yeah, you are on the right track here. Which of these two clauses could stand on its own as a sentence?
The latter.
Yes. If I took this away, right, then everything after the comma could stand on its own as a sentence, right? This is what we call an independent clause. While the first part of the sentence is what we call a subordinate clause, right? If I took away everything after the comma, could this still stand on its own as a sentence? The part I have in brackets. No, this would be a sentence fragment, right? So yeah, this is a subordinate clause. It requires connection to another clause to make it into a sentence. So typically what you're going to want to do when you are framing your own thesis statements, right? The idea you're reacting against should go in a subordinate clause, and the idea that you are promoting should be in an independent clause, right? This is also what that homework assignment is going to ask you to do. It's going to give you a couple of thesis statements that are set up like this, and it's going to ask you to kind of explain them in these terms, right? Like, what's the actual argument here? What are the two ideas that are being held in tension, right? Okay, so any questions? Give you a minute. Going once, going twice. Okay, so let's try another example, and this is going to be, the purpose of this is to show you how to continue to develop a thesis after you've already come up with a basic idea, right? So, maybe not many of you have seen Alien. How many of you have seen Titanic? Only 2 of you. Okay, 3. Okay, you didn't want to admit it. You didn't want to admit you'd seen it, but...
Only because it has Leonardo DiCaprio.
Okay, so that's about half of you. That's enough to work with this. Yeah, I guess I really just need to start watching newer movies. Okay, so what's Titanic about?
A love story.
Okay. So you said a love story, and you said, Brittany?
Boat crashing.
Okay. Yes. For those of you who are not aware, the boat does in fact sink, right? So yeah. So the backdrop for the film is one of the worst nautical disasters in history, right? Yes, the sinking of the HMS Titanic in the North Atlantic. But is the sinking of the ship what the movie's really about?
It's just part of the plot.
Yeah, it's really that's kind of happening in the background, right? As you have this love story developing between these two characters. So we're already making a decision that's moving us in the direction of a thesis here, right? That, well, superficially the movie is about this historical event, it's just using that event as a backdrop, and we're going to focus on something else, right? We're going to instead focus our attention on the love story here. And what's this? Tell me a little bit about this love story, those of you who are familiar with the movie.
It's an affair.
Okay.
She's having an affair.
Okay. In what way is it an affair?
She has a husband, and she's married.
Husband or fiance?
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, fiance.
Okay. Yeah. So
Still an affair either way.
yeah. I mean, she is attached to someone, right? So
She's only with him because he's rich.
Yes. So we have, our female lead, right, Rose, who, I always want to call her Lily, probably just because it's another flower name, and I have to keep, when I do this exercise, I constantly have to correct myself, Rose, it's fucking Rose. But yeah, so Rose, we know, is engaged to a rich piece of shit, right? Mm-hmm. Not only is he rich, he's also a genuine turd. Alright, so Rose is engaged to a wealthy turd. What else do we know about this love story?
Jack is kind of in the opposite position.
Okay. In what way?
That he's not yet wealthy, but he's also a genuinely decent guy.
Okay. So yeah, he is poor. And, alright, as far as we can tell, not a turd. Okay, what else can we say about these two characters and about their romance? Just kind of this quick superficial glance at the movie.
Very passionate and short-lived.
Okay, yeah, short-lived. Hey-oh. Yeah, this is a short-lived relationship. And are these characters who would have met and formed a relationship on land,
No.
how likely is it they would have run into each other?
Next to 0.
Okay, yeah, so we can start by thinking about like the special nature of the ship here, right? Okay, so maybe I'm going to throw this out as our first working thesis idea, right? That the ship, right, so in the movie Titanic, normal social codes are suspended while characters remain on the ship. Right, social class doesn't seem to matter. But then let's think about how well that holds up as we look at the rest of the evidence here. So, are social rules suspended for everybody on the ship? Or just for Rose and Jack? Do we see other people forming cross-class romances all over the place? Or even occupying each other's spaces?
There was a definite division between the wealthy and the people.
Yeah,
the
rich
others.
rich people above decks, poor people below decks, right? And when somebody goes someplace they're not supposed to,
There's an issue.
it's an issue, yeah. Even when Jack is invited to have dinner with Rose's family after stopping her from throwing herself off the ship, right? Then, they treat him like something they scraped off their shoes. So, how did Jack and Rose meet in the first place?
She was about to commit suicide.
Yeah, and he talked her down, right? And they were both someplace they weren't actually supposed to be, right?
Yeah.
So they only got together by breaking the rules. So this already leads us to question this original thesis, right? Okay, if they're the only ones who can get away with this, and they can only do it by breaking the rules and going places they're not supposed to, right? That places neither of them are supposed to, then how might we reframe this? How might we revise this statement?
You should specify it to just them, but I don't know if they might not be brought up.
Okay, well, let's try something like this and tell me if this is what you were thinking, okay? So, while Titanic allows Jack and Rose to break with social norms or with class norms, the division of the ship into rich sections and poor sections means they can only do so by finding some neutral space. Where technically neither of them is allowed to be. Does this seem like a reasonable reading of what we've got so far?
Or you could frame it that the ship's division like ultimately causes their downfall, like the downfall of their relationship.
Okay, how so?
Because in the end, Rose's fiance is able, like whenever the ship is sinking,
Mm-hmm.
Rose's fiance is able to get her onto a lifeboat. It was like with the promise that he's gonna make sure Jack gets onto a lifeboat, but then
Okay.
it was like a lie.
Yeah. And I
He was
think,
only able to do that because
yeah, I think what you're kind of getting us to our next revision of this, right? As we apply more evidence to this, right? So, of our couple here, right, who lives and who dies? Who is at the end of the movie lying sprawled out on a gigantic door that could easily fit 2 people? While the other is freezing to death in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Yeah, the rich girl lives and the poor boy dies, right? So what does that suggest about the movie's values? Who does it value more? Yeah, Rose is valued enough to let her live, right? And in fact, if we look also at other, who else survives, right? Who gets the lifeboats?
The women and the children.
All the women and the children?
99% of them.
What's that?
The people who win?
Yeah, the rich women and children get the lifeboats, right? The poor get locked down below decks and told to just stay there and wait it out, right? So, there's actually, there's an infuriating scene in which, an Irish immigrant mother is putting her 2 children to bed, right? Knowing that they're all about to drown. So, while it does kind of give you these kinds of heart-tugging moments that suggest sympathy with the poor, right? At the same time, granted, this is partly because you're dealing with a historical event, and so you're constrained by how things actually played out. But the rich characters are allowed to survive and thrive, right? Mostly. And the poor characters are largely left to die, right? So, how might we then, I think, and you were kind of taking us in that direction, Michaela, right? How might we then revise this thesis in light of all this? What's the next place we might take this thesis statement? I realized that about half of you had biolab this morning, so it's
Well, Titanic seems to be a love story. It's more about the dichotomy between the rich and the poor classes,
okay.
and how it can affect people trying to intermingle between them.
Okay, so would you say then would it be a fair way to restate what you're saying as that Titanic looks like it wants to challenge class structure but ends up reinforcing it? Is that what you're saying, or?
It's more of just a showcase of what happens when people try to break them. I don't know whether they were trying to reinforce it or not.
Okay. So, tell me if this is something like what you're thinking. Okay. So, are you okay?
The whole microscope thing this morning
Oh.
from lab,
Oh.
like my eyes are like, I don't know what's wrong with me.
Uh-huh.
I'm good.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. If you need to step out, it's okay.
I'll be fine.
Yeah. Can you remind me what you were saying, Ethan?
The movie kind of toys around with intermingling between the two classes and
Okay.
how that can affect two people trying to.
Okay, if mingling is what we want to call that, yes, by allowing Jack and Rose to mingle.
For lack of better words.
Fraternize. By allowing Jack, okay. Plays with challenges to be played by allowing Jack and Rose to mingle. One more time.
By demonstrating the personal and social consequences.
Okay. The severe consequences of their rule breaking lead to his death or to their punishment or
Some sort of dramatic conclusion.
okay. And so essentially what we've been doing, right, is like we started with one working thesis, right? And we keep applying a new piece of evidence to it and coming up with a more refined, specific version of that thesis, right? So we call that evolving your thesis. And this is what you're going to be expected to do in your papers, right? This is how you can actually use a thesis to structure your paper. The topic sentence of each subsequent paragraph should be the new, more refined version of your thesis. So when you get to the conclusion, the thesis that you're going to end up with isn't going to be quite the same as it was at the beginning, right? Now, if it ends up being totally different, right, completely unrelated to your original thesis, then something has gone pear-shaped somewhere and you need to go back to the drawing board, right? But it should be a more refined and specific version of what you started with, right? So I think, did I use the analogy of a science experiment with you, or was that with the other class? Other class, okay, yeah. Again, yeah. When I get two classes back to back, I forget what I told one and what I told the other. So in the sciences, right, you start with a hypothesis, right? You make an observation, and you propose an explanation, right? And then you keep testing that observation, right, that hypothesis, against new data to see if it holds up, right? You're doing the same thing in an analytical paper in the humanities, right? You are coming up with a theory based on a hypothesis, right? Not a theory. That's not how theory works in the sciences, right? If it's a theory, then they're pretty sure that's what is actually going on. You come up with a hypothesis, and you just keep testing it. And as you test it, you refine it. So, does anybody have any questions about any of this thus far? Okay, so what I would... Oh, yeah, Brittany, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
So where would you put it in your writing? Like, because, in high school, they would tell us it's the last sentence of the first paragraph. Is that still...
Yeah, in general, that's still going to be where you're going to put your thesis. But you don't have to. In fact, when you're drafting, you may not reach your thesis your real thesis till the end of the paper, right? Now then, your thesis would go back to the beginning of the paper when you're revising, right? But sometimes you won't really come up with your real idea until you get to the end or close to the end, right? Which is also why I generally say that introductions and conclusions are the last part of the paper you should write. Sit down and write the body paragraphs before you try to do an introduction or a conclusion. Know what it is you're actually talking about and trying to argue before you sit down and try to guide your reader into that. But we'll go into more detail with that next time. But yeah, in general, yeah, in your finished paper, yeah, the thesis should probably go near the end of the first paragraph. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it's not a bad rule of thumb.
So whenever we're writing
Mhm.
a paper and we start out with that first thesis, it's broader.
Yes.
And then with each body paragraph, it's more specific.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, think of it as like almost kind of like being like a funnel, right?
Uh-huh.
Where you start with a fairly broad but still arguable thesis, and then you just keep getting narrower and narrower, right?
Okay.
As you test it. All right, other questions? Okay, so I was gonna have y'all do an exercise with this stuff from last time, but we're at about the end of the period, and I can see that some of you are fading. So we'll just, we'll call it here. What I'd like you to do, like, work with this sheet at home. I think you were not here when I just looked at this. So work with this sheet at home, right? You tried to generate smaller claims from it last time. See if you can come up with a thesis that will account for a pattern that you see in most of the evidence, right? And be prepared to revise it and to test it against other pieces of evidence. And we'll come back and start with that next time. Okay?
When is the homework due that you had on the board?
Thursday.
Thursday?
Yeah.
Will we be back in the regular classroom on Thursday, or?
I don't know. So here's what they told me. The part that was supposed to come in for the air conditioner this morning didn't. So they were waiting for it to come in this afternoon. If it comes in this afternoon, things might be back to normal tomorrow. If it doesn't, who knows when the hell things are back to normal. So yeah, I will keep you posted, and I will let you know when we're where we're going to be, and because I can't guarantee we'll be here again, and when we'll be back in the regular classroom. So just look out for emails from me.